Welcome to Leading in Change. This is a podcast where we talk about what it's like to lead, not just through change, but in change. And so we're going to be talking about decision-making and uncertainty. I think the thing we're hearing so much right now is that decision-making is really hard. And how do you do it when you don't have complete information or all the information? How do you know that you're making the right decision? And so by the end of this episode, hopefully you'll have some frameworks for how to make better decisions and some tools to help you have confidence knowing that you are effectively making the right decisions and change. Before we get into it, Devin, let's start with an icebreaker.
Okay.
Would you say that you are a fast or a slow decision maker, and how do your strengths play into that?
I think I'm a little both. I think I'm pretty action oriented and I want to attack things. So that makes me really fast with some decisions. But I would also say I'm a bit of a procrastinator. So I want often, if it doesn't feel like a rush, I'd like to wait and see if there's more information that might influence my decision. So I probably drive people crazy with some decisions that I don't think are important right in the moment, and I will drag them out. But I think when it really matters, when we're in crisis, when I've had the hardest times in my life, in some ways, I think I have tons of clarity and know exactly what needs to happen because it just forces that for me.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, I think.
Yeah. I feel the exact same way. I think it's a little bit an Enneagram 8 thing. They say go with your gut as an 8. And so I have, in times of high pressure, I feel like the most clarity because it's like I just know in my gut exactly, like my whole body knows like this is the right answer. And I feel so confident moving in those times. And when I do deliberate, it's when I feel kind of mediocre about it. And I'm like waiting for something to give me some more just pizzazz, some more,
There are
juice.
things I really don't care about.
Yeah.
I just don't think they're that important.
Yeah. And
But
then
I
I'm
think
painfully slow.
and people are like, you're just like, I'm just not feeling motivated enough to care about making this decision. So maybe it can wait.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting what you say about, and I don't know if other people know what Enneagram 8 is, so maybe we want to say something about that. But I would say and this is Enneagram 8 coming out, I think I make great decisions.
Yeah.
And I think I give good advice.
Yeah.
And I'm also super logical, and that probably helps. And where I fall down is that I'll make decisions and not fully think through the impact on the people around me.
That's right. I see that.
Because I make it with logic.
Yeah.
And then sometimes once I get aware of it or somebody makes me aware, then I try to be thoughtful about it. At least I do now. But 20 years ago, I wouldn't have. I was just like, screw it. It's a good decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
Live with it.
I totally get that. Okay. So let's jump we'll go into Enneagram another time.
Look it up, people.
It's great. I love Enneagram. Okay. So let's talk about why is decision-making during change hard? I think leaders are expected to make decisions so rapidly. I think leaders are being asked to make more decisions than ever, right? And I think kind of the paradox of that is the more information you have, sometimes the more crippling it can be, right? Like we have more information at our fingertips now than ever. I think AI gives you more decision-making tools, more information now than ever. So, what makes what brings that paradox to life? What makes it so hard to lead when there's more decisions and more information?
Yeah, I think right, when we talk about leading and change, it just means that more decisions are required because things are moving so fast. And I think you're right. We've got a lot more information. I think what makes it hard is that it's how to weigh that information and how to value that information and how much of it is just noise and how much of it really matters. And I think that's why when there's a lot of information, we can think, great, that should help this decision be better. But what I think often what we have is a lot of information, and trying to drill that down to the things that really matter is where it gets confusing when there's too much coming at you.
I think
and then
that's
if you're
right.
rushed, it just makes it that much worse because you have less time to discern what's good information and what's not good information.
Yeah. I want to drill into that for a second. One of the things that I see happen is what I'll call analysis paralysis, where I see so many leaders feel like okay, I really need to slow down, which sometimes slowing down is the right decision, right? But belabor a decision for so long. And why is that not the right move? And in change in particular, and what advice would you give to leaders that are dealing with high change in that position?
I mean, I think I'd say a couple of things. One is that absolutely not making a decision is a decision within itself, and not always a good one, because you're making a decision not to make a decision, even though you don't feel that that's what you're doing. And I think when things are moving fast, you can get behind. You can lose a window. You can be slower to market. You can, what kind of decisions do we make? We make business decisions. We make decisions that have to do with technology, people, all kinds of things that could add to that list. When we're slow with people decisions, it's slowing down the team. You're not efficient. And around all of this is that there are people around you that are wondering why you're not making a decision. Why aren't you making a decision? Why aren't you doing something about that? And that has a whole nother effect on the business, on the team, and things like that. So, and what's interesting is that a lot of those people think, well, the decision would be easy if it was mine. Like
That's
everybody's
right.
gone, until
That's
you
right.
have to make the decision, everybody thinks it's an easy decision.
That's right. A couple things that stuck out as you were saying that. One, I think that a lot of leaders overestimate the impact of a decision, right? When I think the truth is, a mentor said to me one time, make a move, then make it right. Meaning, if you make the move and if it doesn't feel right, make it right. If you figure it out on the other side, but you're always going to have more information on the other side of a decision. Whereas you're operating from a finite amount of information the more you wait. And I kind of think of change. They always say change comes in waves, right? And so you look at, you know, you want to go with the flow, or do you want to be, hit over and over by the waves of change? And I think that kind of like staying stagnant, staying still, belaboring a decision, it just compounds, right? It just creates, I think, more.
Well,
I don't
yeah.
know.
And why do people want to do that, right? And I think a lot of that is fear of making a wrong decision. So Corn Ferry
Mm-hmm.
research is like 90% of the problems of mid-level managers and above are ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
What is ambiguity but being in change?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's successful managers are right about 65% of the time. So most of the decisions are ambiguous, meaning there's no clear, perfect right answer. And second, about 35% of the time, you're going to be, and I'll say wrong. No, wrong might not be horrible, but
Yeah.
maybe it's just, if I'd known more, maybe I would have done it differently.
Right.
So getting comfortable not being perfect is
I think that's right.
part of it. And I think in change, our constant change, that's even more true. Like
Yeah.
get comfortable making wrong decisions. There's the Mark Twain, quote, I think, and it's good decisions come from experience. Experience comes from making bad decisions.
I love that. That's exactly right. I mean, I always say the best way to learn is to do, right? So that's
And
kind
to
of like an
screw up.
extension of that, and screw up and say, oh, well, that didn't work out right.
Yeah.
I think to your point about people are afraid of failure, what even is failure? What really is the worst that can happen? I mean, we say this all the time. Like, what is really the worst thing that can happen? And I think people catastrophize in their mind, like, I'm going to get fired and the company's going to go under. And it's like, really? The likelihood of that is so
You're
low.
not that important.
And it's not, and if it all hinges on this one decision, like, that's a structural problem that's much greater than this one decision, right?
We just can't, we're human. And
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, it really isn't the end of the world when we make a decision that's not perfect or not right. And if we would do that earlier, ask that question, well, what's the worst thing that can happen?
Yeah.
And if you're like, well, I can live with the worst thing, then roll.
That's right. I agree. Jeff Bezos has that framework, doors you can walk back out of. Yeah, I probably said that wrong, but doors, that you walk through, that you can walk back out of, and then doors you walk through and you can never go back. And so knowing, like, need to be more deliberative when you're going through a door that you can't back out of. When you make a decision that it's really hard to untangle, but you'd be surprised at how many decisions you can walk back, or how many, you know, you go forward with a plan, you can pivot that plan. It's not like it's truly unchangeable.
Mm-hmm.
If that
No,
makes sense.
yeah, I 100% agree. And if we had that in our heads, it would probably, we'd have a lot less grief, because I think we suffer with decisions.
Yeah.
People suffer with decisions
Yeah.
often.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question. What's a
Mhm.
moment, personal or professional, when waiting for more information was the wrong move and made the situation worse, not better?
Well, when I think about, for me, and when I also think about a lot of my clients, I think it's almost always around people.
Say more.
Well, and I think we can think about this personally. We can also think about professionally. I think because of relationship, that we can often know that we need to make a decision and make a change. Right? That could be in our personal lives. That could be at work. And to me, those are the decisions that we often wait too long on, and it ends up having negative effects. And so if we use the work example, I was just with a client this week, and there were two roles they told me about where these people are failing, one director, one manager, and they've waited, and it hasn't been working. It hasn't been working for a while. And we're not talking about weeks. We're talking about year plus. In one case, a couple of years. And now we're at the point, they're like, we need your help. But waiting has ended up causing the executive level, the VPs, for everybody to look at them and say, why aren't you dealing with this? Now you look bad. And what happens to the team around them is you start seeing that playing out in the team, who start saying, why aren't you dealing with this? And trust breaks down and teamwork breaks down. So when I think about my own life, and I also think about a lot of the decisions that I see the leaders that I work with dealing with, a lot of times the ones that really end up dragging and causing problems. And if I frame it as coming from the best place, well, we should deliberate this more. It's people's lives, it's a relationship. But I think that's what gets us to, because we're very slow and sometimes wait much too long, and other things start collapsing around it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I see people belabor people decisions all the time. And I think, I'll give an example: holding off on hiring. It just compounds the issues of the team being constrained, of the team feeling like there's lack of direction, of the team feeling supported. So, like, get them in
Right.
there. The opportunity cost, people so rarely weigh the opportunity cost of waiting. They're only thinking about, like, well, if I make this investment now, well, what's going to be lost if you would have had that person on the team? What could you have grown? What's the value creation opportunity that could have happened if you did
Yeah.
have someone on the team?
I love that you brought up the other side of that, because I do think that's the other side of it. And I get it, right? It's one of the biggest investments we make. And at the same time, was work with a client yesterday, and they probably aren't staffed up. Somebody quit. They've got nobody to back them up. She's like, I'm going to have to do it. And I was like, what's the cost of that? And so I was like, okay, next week we are kicking into some more serious team capacity planning and building. We need to understand exactly what your risk and needs are. And I think for a lot of people, that's taking a look at that and making people decisions, hard ones and just challenging ones are huge. And then from a leadership perspective, it doesn't surprise me that we both, are coming up with the people stuff, because honestly, that's a big
All
part of
problems
it.
are people problems. I mean, so I want to get into some of the a framework that you use around this. But one thing you said that I want to drill in on for a second. You talked about how your client said somebody quit, and now I'm going to have to pick up that stuff. So often people see a decision as black and white or binary. And I remember some advice. I went to a design thinking training, and one of the things they said is find the third option. And so I use this all the time whenever staff leave. That I literally just had this conversation with a client. She had somebody go out on medical leave. She's my client is totally spinning out. And I said, go on Fiverr right now, look for someone who can do this on an hourly basis, find a good review. Like, you can find someone on Fiverr, you can hire a contractor, you can get somebody in here tomorrow to keep the ship afloat while to stabilize, while you figure out what the long-term plan is. You don't have to have the long-term plan tomorrow, but like, how do you stabilize for today? And thinking about it in the binary of, I have to do it myself or everything fails, that's rarely reality, right? And so what are the other options you can bring to the table?
I
The other
love
thing
that.
I think about in change is, you can think in shorter, when things are changing all the time, short-term decisions actually can be an asset. What's going to get me to tomorrow so I have more information to make a better decision the next day, right?
Yeah, I think what you said is super important. And actually, when we were kicking this around the other day, I was like, creativity. And I do think people get down to there, it's this or this. We're either doing this or this. And I think whether it's people or it's other things, it's like, how could we be creative? What is another alternative? How else could we solve for this that we're not thinking of right now?
Yeah.
And I do think that we get very, you know, it's A or it's B.
Yeah.
And no one says this.
What about C, D, E, F?
Yeah, there are lots of ways to get there, or there's some short-term solutions that buy us time.
That's right.
But we know it's the right thing, and it gets us from point A to point B, and then we'll be smarter, and then we can make a bigger decision.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that.
Yeah. And when you do that, let's say you make a short-term decision, set a time horizon, and within the next month, we want to have a long-term plan, but this is what we're doing in the interim, right?
Yeah. And people
Mhm.
feel good. People want decisions. They want to moving forward.
Mhm.
They might not always love it, but they appreciate you making it. So I think when things come up, someone leaves unexpectedly, you realize you've got to jump into a new line of business. I think people really appreciate it when you say, like, okay, here's what we're going to do. And everybody likes a plan. Everybody kind of likes a decision. And I want to talk later about just making decisions and then
let's talk
making
about
them
that.
work
Yeah.
for other people.
Yeah, let's talk about
I don't know.
that.
It might be a little bit of a jump, but
No, I think we're talking a lot about getting to a decision, right? And so, what's the right amount of information that you need to make a decision? How do you judge if this is a short-term decision or I need to make a longer-term decision? How do you start thinking through that?
I think it's often kind of what you said, almost a 1-2 punch. I think something happens or something comes up. I mean, look, when you've got time, when you know something's coming, you've got time to deliberate and get information and do all that. But often we need to make quick decisions because something's changed. And I think sometimes it is a 1-2 punch. Sometimes it's a quick solution. Okay, here's what we're going to do right now. Because right now we need something that solves for the next 2 weeks, the next 3 weeks, while the initial things are playing out. And then there's a bigger decision, and that bigger decision then can be slowed down, like you said, so that you can actually do your due diligence and make a decision that's better for the long term.
Yeah.
So
Okay, you have I know you have a framework for helping people through this. Can you walk us through it?
I think the first thing is to gather information or evidence. So what are the facts? What do we know? What do we need to know in order to move forward? And so data, information, all those things, so evidence that we need to gather in order to have what we need to make this decision. So I think that's the first thing. I think after that, I need to tap into my experts. There are people who know more than I do. There are people who have different perspectives. And I think going into decision making, knowing that you're probably too close to it, and you know this, Adrian, because we both work with clients. And so when I'm sitting with someone, they're describing a situation, I'm not emotionally attached. So from the outside in, I'm going like, wait, you absolutely need to deal with that. You do know that's the path you have to go down. But the emotions, the relationship, being too close to it. And I think it's why we give other people better advice and sometimes we give ourselves because we're too close to it. So I would say you tap your experts. Who knows more than you? Who has a different angle? Who sees it differently? Just making sure you're not making decisions in an echo chamber. You're not making decisions just based on your own thoughts and what's between, your ears. because you're 100%. I don't care how smart and experienced you are not thinking of everything. And I think the last piece is to evaluate and really think, if we do these things, what are the consequences? One of the questions you asked earlier is like, is this undoable? Can we undo this? Um, who does it impact? When we're making decisions, we often don't think of all the stakeholders, and we don't always think of who might be impacted or affected by our decisions. So, and I do that all the time, right? I'm super logical. I know what needs to happen. And I'll be like, oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. Oh, yeah, you think they'll be upset about that? And they're like, they're absolutely going to be upset. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I didn't think about that right away. I'll factor it in once I know, but sometimes I'll completely miss that piece. So evaluating and really understanding the consequences, the unintended consequences, the things that'll be touched. And then I think you can absolutely be in a better position to make a good decision. So evidence, so gathering the facts and information, tapping your experts, evaluating your options, and then making the best one. Might not be perfect, but the best one.
I love that. I think that's great. As you run through those, the place that I see people missing on different parts of this quite a bit, but I will say I think people forget to look outside a lot. And I'm not being like gratuitous when I say that, but I think asking the experts is so critical just for outside perspective. And I'm not even saying like paid counsel, like talk to someone you trust about the situation going on. That's why I think like a personal board of directors is so critical for leaders. I think the loneliness at the top for a lot of leaders is very real. And so getting outside perspective really helps give you perspective on your situation. I'm working with a leader right now who's brought me in on a conflict that's happening within the company that's got large ramifications for the company's revenue, for their sell potential, for a bunch of other things. And one of the things that one of the people involved, was making a recommendation that was just so clearly ass backwards. I don't know how else to say it. It was just like, this is not a good idea. And several other people in the room I could tell were like, this is not a good idea, but nobody wanted to say it. Right. And so I was able to come in and say, look, I hear where you're coming from on this. And I think we can get to what I see as your end goal, but here's how I would get there. And I kind of proposed a different approach. And they were like, oh my God, that's so much better. I don't know why I didn't think of that. You're totally right. That would have been ass backwards way to do it. And it's like, but he couldn't see it. He couldn't see it in the moment, way too close to it. And the people around him were not saying anything. And so you've got to recognize that, especially in high change, I think, and when decisions feel high stakes, you may not be getting all the information. You might be operating in a vacuum, and so you need to kind of look outside and get some counsel.
I think it's interesting, because when we say making decisions in high change, what that means is you're often making decisions, and especially I think when you're experienced and you've been doing something a long time, you're making decisions off, your experience from maybe the last 20 years. But that's changed. And so that's another thing I think you've got to watch out for is if I have a history of making, if I believe I've had a history of making good decisions for 20 years, then I'm going to overly rely on my decision making. But that might not play out the same because now we are in a different world. And so that's where you have to be open, I think, to other people's ideas, to saying yes to things that you might not value, but they are important.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not what I think is important, but I'm also operating from a different experience. And then I also think interesting, because you said, board of directors, your personal board of directors, your experts, sometimes your team's the expert. So you also have to make sure that you are tapping into those important stakeholders. And if your team is a big part of this, you should be tapping into them. Like your experts can be a lot of different people. Might be the people closest to the work, might be somebody internal, external, couple of couple of layers below you, a layer above you, and getting good at saying, I need your advice, or I love your advice, or I love your perspective, and is good. And I'd like to hear you say more. You brought in the hesitancy to push back, realizing that someone who has a bigger title
Mm-hmm.
and longevity can be intimidating to push back on.
Mm-hmm.
And you can believe that, well, can I really push back on this person? They
That's right.
seem very determined in what they're saying. You know,
And
they have a, so automatically you're in a position where you might not get great advice and you might
yeah,
not get pushback.
that's right. That's right. And I think in uncertainty, even talented, knowledgeable people lose their confidence,
Yeah.
right? And so recognizing that sometimes you have to ask a lot of questions and draw the information out. One of the things, this is where I do love AI. I love to use AI to be a sounding board for decision making. I think a lot of people use it as in kind of administrative capacity, which I do, and it's great for that. But it can be great counsel if you give it full context and you're not kind of poisoning the well with your own bias, too much, or you tell it, I want you to push back on me and I want you to help me get to the right best decision. One of my favorite exercises is a pre-mortem. So let's say we make this
Mm.
decision. Let's imagine a post-mortem a year from now. What do we think that will look like? What do we think is going to happen? You know, what's working based off of this decision? What went wrong with this decision? And that's where if get your team engaged in that conversation. And I think getting them to surface some of that is a good thing. And that's also where I think leveraging AI can be really helpful.
You intervened in that situation where nobody would say anything. If you hadn't been there, what if they just kept going? So I think and we can forget to do it, or I think you have to develop a habit to do it, is to say, okay, I need you to tell me what could go wrong.
Mm.
Somebody be the opposition on this. Somebody fight this idea, because that's the only way we're going to know it doesn't have holes in it. So if you can do that with big decisions as a practice, especially if they involve maybe your peers or your team, I think that can be a good way to say, we're going to have to work hard to make good decisions. And so who wants to be the next, bring the
Yeah.
negativity?
Well, I worked with a team that used to appoint a devil's advocate, and I
Yes.
loved to do it because it's my personality, right? Like, how many times a day do I say, like, well, I can see both sides? And so the role was poke holes. The role was provide a counterpoint of view. And I think that permission structure of calling it out on the front end creates the space to get the information out so that way you can get to the next right decision.
Yeah, and if you don't have one person that can do that, you can always go around and say, okay, I need to everybody come up with one
Yeah.
thing that can make this thing go wrong.
Yeah.
And so you invite people to actually share the thing,
Yeah.
and you listen and you weigh it in. You
Mhm.
weigh that into your decision making. So I think that's good.
One thing I also see leaders do is they will, or a way that I see leaders get decision making wrong, I'll put it this way, is they'll make a decision. I'm putting it in air quotes because then they go and revisit it and they keep reopening the door and they keep projecting uncertainty and they keep um, kind of,
Hedging
yeah,
on the yeah, and so it doesn't really feel like a full end decision.
that's right. So what do you do? How do you work with a leader that is doing that?
Well, I always try to remind people want you to make a decision. They're wondering why you're not making a decision. And I would wonder why they're doing that. And it could be because they feel like if they don't own it completely, then they can't be blamed for it. I think that goes into when we talk about leading and change and we talk about organizations and change, and that there are no perfect decisions and you're making more of them, then I think we have to look at culture and say, is this the person? Is this coming from the person who just wants to be perfect and wants to be right? Or have we set up an organization where there are consequences for not being right, where you're going to be punished for it? And I think that's where often we see some hedging
Mm.
or some not wanting to own decisions completely.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just working with a team recently, and I don't think it was that they thought they were going to get in trouble, because I checked that out. But they were a young company. They needed to make decisions and move fast. And when the CEO saw that they missed out and lost some money on a deal because they hadn't moved fast and made this decision, and we ended up spending about half a day talking about decision making. And there was, in some cases, a hesitancy to act and make a decision because they weren't sure if it was theirs, and they were also wanted to be, they're young, still building their careers, wanted wanted to make good decisions. They weren't sure if it was their decision to make. They weren't sure who they should tap to get information to help them make the decision. So they didn't know who to go to, and they didn't know when to escalate or just make the decision. So I think that hedging is coming from someplace. It could be personal, but it could also be organizational.
Yeah.
And it doesn't breed, it doesn't increase confidence for sure.
Yeah.
And I definitely want to talk about, because this makes me go into thinking about, and I think both think this is important. It's like we often hedge too when the decisions we have to make involve competing values.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's often the case,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to people decisions or, there's anyway,
Yeah.
values and competing right decisions or competing values cause people a lot of grief.
Yeah. Okay, I want to click through a few things and then I want to drill into values. So, one thing I heard you say is people will not own it completely because they don't want to be blamed for it. And so that makes me think about, the trust pyramid, Patrick Lencioni's, 5 stages to, healthy teams. And trust is at the foundation of all of that, right? And so if you don't feel trusted that you can make a mistake, then you're not going to own the outcomes because you don't want to be held accountable, right?
Decisions don't get made, and if decisions aren't made, then goals aren't achieved.
Yeah.
Then we're nothing, and you don't get results. So.
That's right. So there could be like a 5 dysfunctions of a team happening. It could be that there's not clear decision rights. So do I have the right to make the decision? Who does make the decision? How do I escalate it? What's the process for escalating it? I think decision rights, we've talked about this several times, like teams need to be clear in them. And then I recently read an HBR piece that talked about when rules get broken or when big mistakes are made, looking at intent versus outcome. And it was interesting to me to think about it in that context, because was somebody trying to do the right thing and they just made the wrong call, or they just did it the wrong way, they didn't follow the process, or whatever it was, that that's different from somebody that did it for the wrong intent. And so understanding that piece of it, I think, is important for leaders. And then that does come back to values. So talk about, what role do values play in making effective decisions?
I think we're all making decisions. All our decisions are influenced by our values on some level, right? If I value financial security, then I might be slower to make a decision or really vet financial investment decisions. I have this cool case study that I do in an emerging leader class that I teach, and it's meant to help people think through the decisions they would make. And I often find that they make their decision very quickly, and they run over people who would because they're in groups, would make a different decision. And when we really start digging in, they start seeing the other sides of it and why it's not as simple as decision as they think it is. And so when you're moving from, because you and I do leadership development stuff and all the time, when you're moving from into higher level roles, you're making decisions that have a lot more impact. So this particular exercise, they have to make a decision to lay someone off. So their bosses told them, we have to cut staff, and they have to choose between one of 3 people. And one person is excellent. It's this particular case study, I'll say, is healthcare related. So one of the people is excellent clinically and wonderful with advocating for patients, but pisses the doctors off. But one of them is a great team member, doesn't have all the skills, but just a delight to work with. And then the third one is a long-term employee who's solid, but has been struggling the last couple of months and not able to catch everything. And so it's kind of a little bit fallen out of favor recently. And so when you ask them in small groups, okay, and there's some other employees there, who are you going to go? Almost always they choose this longer term employee who's not been performing well lately. And sometimes there's some discussion, but that's a really easy decision for them to make. But then we start talking about other things. And we start talking about, well, is longevity and loyalty matter? And somebody usually raises their hands like, that's what I said. I mean, she's been there for 10 years, right? But nobody listened to him because it was easy to make that decision. Well, she hadn't been doing her job the last 2 months. Um, some people, they almost always want to keep the great clinician, but they move over the fact that there's the doctors are mad, and if they depend on those doctors to send surgeries, that they're going to have to deal with that because that's a whole nother problem. And then the team is looking at them saying, wait, I've been here 12 years. You're just going to throw me out with the bathwater. So when they really start thinking about it, they realize there are a lot more stakeholders involved. There are a lot more consequences and unintended consequences to their decisions. But often what we're seeing that we're making decisions based on our values. And often what they value is, well, we're clinicians. We value clinical expertise. But then somebody else will be like, but we also value loyalty and we also value teamwork. And so sometimes you're making this decision, you're like, well, yeah, it's really important that we have a great clinician on the floor. It's also really important that we take care of our people and we show that we're not going to just give up on you. You've been here 10 years. We're not going to give up on you because you have a bad month. And yes, we absolutely value being a delight to work with. So which of those values? And so we call these competing right decisions. A few of these decisions could be right. You've got to make the call. And then the whole other thing is that your team is looking at you, and I guarantee you, everybody on that team, you make a decision to lay off the lady who's been with you 10 years, they're feeling like, oh my God, I mean, laying off. Every decision you make, people on your team are going to question that decision. And so then you are telling people who you are by the decisions you make. And that's a whole nother thing. And
Yeah.
then what can you share and how do people understand how you make decisions? How do they understand what's valued in the organization? And are you making decisions that go against that?
I love that.
Because then you know what happens. They go like, well, I mean, have you looked at our values on the website? They say we're family oriented. This doesn't feel family oriented, right? So, and people miss that piece. And so I think one of the big leaps for leaders and emerging leaders, especially, is realizing that they are making decisions. And it's not even just as simple as making a good decision, that you can make a really good decision and still it can be a struggle to live with that decision. You can have to work through some of that with the people around you who wonder why. You sometimes can't share everything, but you have to get people to get it,
That's
to
what I was
get
just
and to
about to say.
trust that
Mhm.
you made the best decision that you
Mhm.
could. And so that's a whole nother thing about decisions. And I do think it's important because I think we don't talk about these things that get in our way that are under the surface sometimes, but they
Yeah.
are and they impact things.
That's absolutely right. Two things that kind of came out of that. So thank you. I think that was such a cool example of how it's ambiguous. You don't have a clear right answer, right? And so a couple of the things that I see happen where leaders really mess up after a decision that makes it wrong, right? Like I said, you can make a move then make it right. That any of those could be the right decision depending on how you handle it after, and any of those could be the wrong decision depending on how you handle it after. And where I've seen people spin out is not owning the decision in a healthy way. So let's take the loyalty one. They decide to let go of the long tenured employee. Let's say there's other factors at play that make it to where, this really is the right move. Okay. You don't have the opportunity to necessarily explain all of that. You just have to own it and make sure that the people that you would be worried about feel supported and celebrated, that long tenure people get some hand to hand combat, some FaceTime with them to make sure they understand their value to the team, right? Instead of going around and trying to diminish this person, or explain your answer, like it almost undermines your leadership when you try to do that. And I see so many leaders spin out in that way of trying to justify it in a public way. And it's just makes you look weak, honestly, a lot of the time.
Yeah. And I think those people ones are hard because
Mm-hmm.
you can't always say everything. I think in other cases, we're going to go ahead and, invest in this new technology. We're going to open this
Definitely.
new market.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got an opportunity. I think we forget to go and say, here's why we're doing this.
You've got to.
This is why but I think people forget they make the decision. They're like, come on, everybody. and they don't really do the work because people aren't going to buy in unless they understand why we're doing it, because often it means other sacrifices. We're not hiring people right now because we're opening a new market. We're going to slow down this because we're going to invest in this. And so there's almost always, people can almost always feel a loss with a decision, because it typically, big decisions, it can mean something on the other side. And when we can, we should not only have people weigh in
Mm-hmm.
to inform the decisions, but we should also do a better job of explaining our decisions. And sometimes little decisions seem like they need explaining. I think I get in trouble with that all the time. I make little decisions, but people probably don't know why I make them, and they're probably perfectly good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But I won't think it's important. Like, it will never dawn on me to explain it.
Yeah.
But
So
explaining it would be good.
let me go back on what I said. So when I say they try to over explain a decision and not own the outcome, I think it's when you can't share all the information. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's so important to explain why you made a decision when you can be totally transparent, because
Mm-hmm.
one, that develops the talent below you. It helps them understand what does good decision making look like. It's not just do it because I said so. It's do it because this is the right decision and here's why. Right. So walking through that logic that got you there, I think, is part of it. And then two, you talked about you've got to bring people in on the decision. I think so often leaders get in an echo chamber where they're just surrounded by people who say, yes, this is a great idea. I'm working with a client on this right now, a major organizational change. And she's got, a handful of people that are really pushing and supportive and at her level that are behind it, but not bringing the team along. And so there's a lot of hesitation, trepidation, fear from the team because they don't understand why these changes are happening, what these changes are going to mean for them. And it's not going to work out if they don't get on board. And so that's the work of, you've got to bring the team along through the process
Yes.
and let them make some decisions along the way, right? Don't put it all on yourself.
Yes. Because they're going to feel better about it. Because I definitely think every decision you make, especially in change, every change you make, that's typically a decision. Everybody around you is thinking, what do I have to gain or lose by what's getting ready to happen, or what happened? And so, as much as you can address that, I think that is good.
Yeah, I agree. There's one last thing before we kind of like bring it all together that we've talked about, which is, really knowing your strengths too. When you were talking about values, I thought about the strength of belief, which is one of the Gallup's Clifton strengths that gives you a really strong internal compass. It helps you separate the wheat from the chaff. Should we do this or not do this? Because you have strong internal core beliefs that help you make decisions quickly and effectively. Um, other kind of strengths that might help you make decisions are activator. They move really fast. They want to move. If you have activator high, you might want to surround yourself with people who are a little bit more deliberative, right? They're going to slow down the process. Conversely, if you're somebody that's really deliberative, you might want to have somebody that helps move things a little bit faster, and is maybe more achievement oriented, weighing in to make sure that you're not bogging down the process unnecessarily. If you've got somebody that's really high futuristic like me, it's really important to have somebody with context in the room who's going to make sure you're thinking about, well, how's this going to impact existing systems, right? And so understanding your own strengths that are assets, but they can also hinder you when it comes to decision making. So how do you kind of balance that through the talents of the rest of the team?
How we're built, what our strengths are, definitely influence all that.
Yeah.
And the other side of those strengths is potentially the thing that gets you in trouble,
Yeah.
when you
That's right.
overuse it.
That's right. Or misapplied or whatever else. Okay. So let's bring it all together. I think the point of all this is decision making is really hard. Decision making and change is especially hard. Um, you talked through, it's a skill that you can develop, learning to be better at decision making. So we have a clear framework that I'm going to read right now. So your framework for making better decisions was look for evidence, talk to the experts, and really evaluate it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would add to that we didn't discuss already?
You're not going to make perfect decisions, but you're going to learn from each one. And part of it in high change environment is just, you've got to make decisions. They won't all be perfect, but they will be moving things forward. And in a high change environment, that can be the most important thing, is to just keep things moving forward and keep adjusting and making decisions to what's in front of you. And also know when you don't, we didn't talk about it, but sometimes you should say, can we wait?
Yeah.
Does a decision have to be made right now?
Yeah.
Or can we make I love what you said. Can we make a short-term decision now?
Yeah.
And we'll know more. We'll be smarter. I mean, often thinking, I was like, let's do this for now. I think we'll be smarter in a couple of months.
I love that. What new information can I gain? And what I would say is don't be passive about that, right? Like one of the things that I do when I'm going to make a decision, my husband and I were talking about repairing the roof on our house. And it's like, okay, what do we need to do in the short term? What do we need to do in the long term? But what information do we need to get to that long term? We know we got to replace the roof. What do we need to learn between now and that decision that will make us smarter on the other side of it, right? And so going out and talking to your different insurance providers or whatever the case may be. You're talking about selling a company. What are the different ways that could look? If you're talking about hiring staff, what are the different ways that this role could change over the next 5 years, and what skills might we need to hire for? So you might make a short-term decision but need to gain more information before you get to that long-term decision.
Absolutely.
Okay. We will end with a question for our listeners. We would love to ask you, what is one decision that you're currently delaying, and what would it cost you to go ahead and make that decision this week? So we would love if you would be willing to share that. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, follow, share, subscribe, all of the things. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. And if you found this helpful, we also have a resilient leadership workbook that we'll be releasing, and we have chapters specific to decision making and leading in uncertainty. So thank you for joining us. Anything else, Devin?
I think that's it. Thank you.